so there's that. So we are going over chapters 2 and 3 today. So it's going to be a marathon of lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. So chapter 2, this is on federalism and the Texas Constitution. So federalism. So this should be a little bit of a review from your federal government class. This idea of federalism, what this means is that we have powers, governmental powers separated between the national level and the state level governments. They do tend to share some roles, and we'll look at a graph in just 1 second where I'll show you what those exact divisions are. And we also have a lot of times where butting of heads happens between the Texas and the federal government. Texas especially is very notorious for suing the federal government over disagreements on if the federal government has overstepped, and they use this argument of federalism. So let me go ahead and show you this graph real quick. So over here you see the national level. You see the concurrent. Concurrent means shared. And you see state. Okay, so for the national level, the national government is responsible for national defense. So this is our military. The currency. This means the maintenance of the dollar. Texas cannot have its own currency. It must use the national level currency. The post office. Foreign affairs, meaning anything to do with other countries. If the United States is interacting with other countries in any way, it must be at the federal level. And interstate commerce. Now, I always tell my students for interstate, a way to help you remember this is Interstate 35. So Interstate 35, it runs from Texas all the way up to Canada. So really Mexico to Canada. So this word interstate means between two or more states. So that should be able to help you remember because Interstate 35, it intersects two or more states. So concurrent, this is powers that are shared. Okay, so both sides have the power to lend and borrow money. However, it works differently for each level. So at the national level, the national government has the power to borrow money from foreign countries. It can borrow money from the American people, something known as a bond. And it can also borrow money from state governments. Okay. Taxation is a concurrent power. We have the national federal income tax. At the state level, we have the sales tax. The state also has the option to enforce an income tax. However, Texas has opted out officially from this ability to have an income tax through one of our amendments. Both sides have the ability to enforce law enforcement. So at the national level, this is where we see things like FBI, the CIA that quote unquote doesn't exist, right? Then at the state level, we have our city police, we have our county sheriffs, and many offices in between. Both sides have the power to charter banks. This means to create banks. Both sides have the power to regulate transportation. So the national government really takes hold over anything involving airlines because that's over the national airspace. These states really start to take control over things like railroads, highways, and all those different sorts of things. So over here on the state side, the state has the power to charter local government. So what this means is that whenever a small town, starts to grow large enough, they're able to petition the state to be able to become an official city within the state of Texas. And that is that chartering that local government, the creation of that city. Education, Texas has almost full jurisdiction over education. We do have some national control over our education system with things like No Child Left Behind. But Texas, for the most part, is able to regulate things like school districts, standards, teaching, certification, all those sorts of things. Then we have the public safety. So this can refer to our police departments. It can also refer to things like our driver's licensing, registration, all those different things. Registration and voting. So that has to do with the procedures for registering for and the process of voting within the state of Texas. And then intrastate commerce. So way to remember this, intrastate means it stays within the state. So it's exactly the opposite of this interstate. Okay, so whereas interstate is two or more states, right? Intrastate is within the state itself. Okay, so one other thing we need to discuss here is this tension that gets created between our state and our national level government when it comes to gerrymandering. So the process of gerrymandering has changed over time. It used to be used to basically make it so that way the minority population's votes got diluted, therefore they did not count, making them count less within our elections. Now it is used more to keep parties in power. Okay, the Republican Party has been very notorious for this, especially for our current redistricting plan that is going on. So over here, you can see this is a map I just drew on the computer, but you can get the concept basically from this. So each one of these is a district. Okay, we have District 1, District 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, the blue represents areas that vote mostly Democrat, and the red represents areas that vote mostly Republican. Okay, so what you can see here is that for each district, with the way that the lines are drawn, basically the Republican Party's supporters, their constituents, their voters, basically count out the Democratic voters, okay, the ones who tend to vote Democrat. And so just to give you an idea, this is an actual map of the state of Texas in one of their voting districts. So one of the number one telltale signs of if there has been gerrymandering going on is if we have a very funky shaped district. Okay, anything that looks very off, right? Doesn't have a normal shape to it. So this is an actual district. This was one of the memes that was going around on social media about who's that Pokemon. It looks like Onyx, right? But this is what we mean when we're talking about gerrymandering, basically drawing the map in a way to make sure that we're diluting different groups' votes. Okay? So there's a lot of controversy going on about these redistricting maps right now. The Supreme Court is actually in the process of reviewing our districting map. So we'll see what goes on with that and the decisions that they make. So this process of federalism. There's two main concepts with this. One is nationalization and one is devolution. Okay? So nationalization, a way you can remember this is this word national, right? It gives more power to the national government, okay? Whereas this devolution, it's the exact opposite of this. It gives power back down to the states. So it's cyclical, meaning that it happens in cycles, and it usually depends on the issues of the time, especially any major issues that are affecting the American people of that time, and then also the party in power at that time. So I just highlighted major shifts in the 1900s. So we have the progressive era. I'll give you a little refresher on that one. That's where we had the big monopolies and the trusts, people like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, although those names sound a little familiar, where they were making monopolies, basically taking over an entire industry. Okay? So the national government, at first, we did see a change a little bit into the 1900s, but at first, the federal government did not take a stand when it came to these big businesses. Okay, so it was the deregulation of big business. In other words, the national government was really practicing that policy of hands off, that laissez-faire. Okay, so since we saw a weakening of the national government, this was devolution. Okay, so 1930s, we see the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal. So remember, that is whenever we had the stock market crash. There were at least 25% of the American people were unemployed. We had starvation, all kinds of things going on within this time period. So this is whenever we saw a huge jump in nationalization. Okay, so the New Deal gave the national government a whole lot of power to be able to deal with the issues that were going on during the Great Depression. Okay, so Republican control, 1980s to 1990s, is really started under President Ronald Reagan. The Republican Party as a whole tends to like to limit national government control, meaning they like to give the states more power than the national government. Okay, so anytime you see the Republican Party in control, that is one of the number one things that they start to do is take the power away from the national government and give it to the states. Okay, and this was a process of devolution. Last one we'll highlight here. Early 2000s, we have had a state of nationalization since the early 2000s that has not really changed. A lot of this has to do with September 11th and the War on Terror. So to give you an idea of the strength of the events that happened during that time frame, the party in control at that time was the Republican Party under George W. Bush. Okay, now remember, the Republican Party favors this process of devolution. But we had things like the Patriot Act, which gave the national government a massive amount of power, especially through denying people the ability to call their lawyers, the ability to have a trial, especially the ability to have a fair trial, right to privacy, all those different things. Those things were taken away for any suspected terrorist, anybody who could fall under that line of being a suspected terrorist under the Patriot Act. Okay, so we saw a major shift in nationalization within this period. Okay, so strong that even the Republican Party were the ones who were coming up with the things like the Patriot Act. So that should give you a good idea of how much of an impact this had on our country. It's actually one of the only things, the War on Terror is actually one of the only things that both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, agree about. Okay, so that should tell you right there how much influence it has on our government. So, the distribution of the constitutional power. So the thing you need to know here is the 10th Amendment. Okay, so the 10 amendments that constitute the Bill of Rights, okay, remember those first 10 amendments, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all those things. The 10th Amendment is the one that basically makes it so that way anything that's not directly said in the Constitution is given to the states. It's known as implied powers, saying that the Constitution did not say that, so it implies that the state is able to do this. Okay, so anti-federalists favored the 10th Amendment. Remember, they were the guys who did not like the Constitution. They had to have the Bill of Rights in order to agree to sign it. So it was inserted to relieve tension and to minimize the fears of the states' rights advocates who believed that this Constitution would enable the federal government to basically run wild over the states and their citizens. Okay? So, the Federalists, they didn't see this Bill of Rights as necessary. They humored the anti-federalists, right? They did end up putting it in, but they did not see it as necessary. Their idea was the Constitution was written in such a way that it was very clear what people could and could not do, what the government could and could not do. So they didn't find it necessary, but they went ahead and put it in there that anyway so they could get that ratification. So we have also something known as the National Supremacy Clause. Okay, so this basically says that no matter what the states do, the federal government has the last say, and that's that. Okay? So, for example, one example I always like to use is whenever we had Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, that basically made it so that way schools had to desegregate. Arkansas outright refused to desegregate their schools. But because of this National Supremacy Clause, the federal government was able to step in, even using the national military, and forced these schools to desegregate. Okay, so that should tell you just how much the power of our federal government, how much they have in relation to the state governments. Because if the state governments do not agree, the federal government can and has the right to step in and use whatever method is necessary to force that state to obey. Okay? So, the distribution of constitutional powers. So, what guarantees do states have? So, each state is guaranteed 2 senators, and then they have at least 1 member in the House of Representatives. Remember, that depends on population numbers. This usually changes from census to census at every 10 years, where they're basically taking numbers of how many people are in each state. And that will change how many representatives that we have every 10 years. Each state has electoral votes equal to the number of U.S. senators and representatives added together. So basically what they do is they take these 2 senators and this House of Representatives number that's based on that census, they add them together, and that's how many electoral college votes we get for the presidential election. We have a guarantee that Texas crimes will be tried in Texas. And we are entitled to protection against invasion. So any foreign country, I highly doubt it, but say if Canada or Mexico or Cuba try to come in and invade our country, we are entitled to protection from our national government, mainly through the military. Okay? So, limitations on the states. So states cannot levy taxes on another state's products. So basically, states cannot have a tariff on other states' products. So let's say that Oklahoma is selling cotton to Texas, and then we have the cotton that is grown in Texas. Let's say that both these things of cotton are used to make t-shirts. Okay? So the t-shirt that is made from the cotton of Oklahoma cannot cost more simply for the fact that it is cotton from Oklahoma. Okay, that's what's known as a tariff. So states cannot do that to each other. They must be of equal value, of equal price. So we also have states cannot make compacts with other states or federal governments without consent of Congress. In other words, states cannot make treaties with other states, nor can they make treaties with other foreign governments without the consent of Congress. Okay? So, the 14th Amendment, this forbids states from denying to persons the equal protection of the laws, basically saying that states have to honor that right to due process, that right to trial by jury, that right to being treated like an American citizen, no matter what your race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender is, all those different things. And it gives Congress enforcement powers within the states should they find them necessary. So, the incorporation theory. So, Basically, the incorporation theory is it applies the Constitution's Bill of Rights to the states. So it's what gives the states their specific powers in the graph over here. Okay? So over here, Article 4. Article 4 of the United States Constitution, it outlines the relationship between various states as well as the relationship between each state in the United States federal government. It also empowers the Congress to admit new states and administer the territories and other federal lands. Okay? States do not have to honor, also under this, other specific laws. Okay? So what this means is, say we're talking about same-sex marriage prior to the Supreme Court decision. Okay? So let's say that we had a couple in California, same-sex marriage couple in California who had been married and then moved to Texas prior to the Supreme Court decision. Texas did not have to honor that marriage, so they would have been considered two single individuals again. Okay? Same thing for reduced barriers to gun access in Texas. So remember how our one of our more recent laws, we have reduced barriers to being able to access ammunition and firearms within the state of Texas. However, if you have a gun in the state of Texas with those reduced barriers, and you go and visit a state outside of Texas, you must then honor that state's laws. Okay? So what's legal in Texas is not always legal in other states. It's just like how we have marijuana legal in Colorado, it's legal in Oklahoma, but the minute you go over the border, and if you have marijuana in your possession, all of a sudden it's no longer legal, and you can be put into jail and fined and those different things. So, Article 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or the executive when the legislature cannot convene against domestic violence. Okay? So what this is saying is that each state is guaranteed that republican form of government. Each state is protected against invasion. And whenever the legislature, if they are not in session, but a legislative decision needs to be made regarding domestic violence, meaning violence that is happening within the nation, then the executive will take over control with that decision. We have the full faith and credit clause. So it addresses the duties that states within the United States have to respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. Okay? So what this means is that, and I took this example from study.com because I feel like it really helps to summarize this idea, is that the full faith and credit clause ensures that states honor the court's judgments of other states. So, for example, let's say someone is involved in a car accident in New Mexico. As a result, the New Mexico court gives them $1,000 in damages. But the defendant, the person who ran into them, lives in Florida and refuses to pay them. The state of Florida will then enforce the judgment from New Mexico and help them to collect their money. Okay? Because if they did not, then they would have to retry their case in Florida again. So in other words, not only would they have to have this case in New Mexico, but they would also have to go through the entire judicial proceedings again in Florida. Okay? So with this full faith and credit clause, what this means is that what other states decide in their court proceedings, other states must also recognize those decisions. So Article 4, we also have the Defense of Marriage Act under Texas. So this was a challenge to the full faith and credit clause because the union of marriage falls under those court proceedings. So in 1996, the National Congress passes a law that states do not have to allow same-sex marriages. They don't have to recognize marriage unions between same-sex couples if the union had been in a different state. So again, if it was in California and that couple had moved to Texas, Texas did not have to recognize that. In 2003, Texas government passed a law prohibiting the recognition of any same-sex marriage, whether it was passed in a city or county of Texas or elsewhere. So what this meant is that, let's say in Austin, where it's a little bit more liberal, let's say a couple was married in Austin because Austin said, okay, this can happen within this city, we'll recognize it here. But within the state of Texas, say if that couple moves outside of Austin, or let's say insurance companies that they're using aren't within the state of Austin, then they did not have to recognize that marriage. Okay, so 2005, we had Texas among 33 other states that established an amendment that defined a marriage as a union between a man and a woman. This is a big deal in Texas only because in Texas, amendments have to be approved by the voters of the state. Okay, so this means that any amendment that goes through the legislature does not have to have the governor's signature. It only has to have the approval of the voters. So the voters had approved this amendment. Okay, but in 2014-2016, the Supreme Court made a series of decisions. When we're talking about the Supreme Court, we're talking about the National Supreme Court, regarding job benefits for spouses and parental rights by divorced same-sex couples. And what happened is they used this to translate the 14th Amendment to apply to all marriages, because the 14th Amendment is supposed to apply all of these exact same civil rights that everybody has to everyone. Okay? So they basically used this to also apply to this marriage union, okay, as a human right, basically. So over here, we have Texas trying to hold its ground whenever it was a part of the whole coalition trying to prevent the allowance of same-sex marriage within the state. But the Supreme Court, the National Supreme Court, said, Texas, you have to recognize this. This has been made at the national level. National level trumps state level. So the state had to go ahead and recognize these unions. So the 11th Amendment to this basically establishes that citizens residing in a different state cannot sue a different state. So for example, a citizen of Texas cannot sue the state of California, and it also establishes that foreign countries cannot sue a state of the United States. Basically, Mexico, say if they wanted to sue Texas, they are not able to do that. They have to sue the United States as a whole. So we have sovereign immunity. So the U.S. Supreme Court rulings have ensured that a state may not be sued by its own citizens or those of another state without the defendant state's consent, nor can state employees sue the state for violating federal law. Pretty interesting, right? So it's a legal doctrine whereby a sovereign or state cannot commit a legal wrong and is immune from a civil suit or a criminal prosecution, strictly speaking. Basically, state immunity. So how is this absolute power for states balanced out by the federal government? So the federal government can sue a state. So this is how someone would get around this, say if they had a huge concern about Texas following constitutional law. Then they would go to the federal government for help. Okay? So it would have to go to the attention of the Supreme Court, and they would make the decision on whether to sue the state instead. So this is whenever you see things like people trying to bring their court of appeals, trying to appeal those legal decisions that are decided on prison terms, execution sentences, all those different things. That is the idea where the Supreme Court of the federal government is the one that is dealing with the state of Texas. Okay? So reserved powers not defined by the Constitution. So state powers, we have the police powers, so this is protection of the health, moral, safety, and the convenience of citizens, and it has a provision for general welfare. This is what was used to create the sheriff, local police departments, maintenance of the Texas branch of the National Guard. Then we have the taxing power, so this is raising revenue to pay the salaries of state employees and meet other costs of government and repay borrowed money. So Texas has an amendment prohibiting income tax, so revenue must come from other sources. This would be things like sales tax, fuel taxes that we pay at the pump, property taxes that you pay on your houses, so on and so forth. We have something known as a proprietary power. So this is public ownership of property, such as airports, energy-producing utilities, and parks. We have the power of eminent domain. So this is taking private property, so this could be somebody's land, this could be somebody's house, stores, and they pay a fair price for various kinds of public projects. So this could be something like highway construction. There's issues of true compensation because under this you only get one offer, and that's from the state. Unlike whenever you sell your house, you can have something known as a bidding war, which means a whole bunch of people are trying to buy your house, so the price keeps going higher and higher and higher. You don't have that option whenever it comes to the state buying your property. We also have issues of environmental preservation and impeding on a national park area, such as the natural gas pipeline they're trying to build through Big Bend State National Park. Okay? So federal-state relations. So we have federal grants in aid. So this is money appropriated, put aside, what that means, by the U.S. Congress to help states and local governments provide needed facilities and services, also known as a generalized grant. So for our block grant, this is a congressional grant of money that allows the state considerable flexibility in how they're going to spend it. Okay? They'll usually give them a broad category on which to spend it. They'll say, okay, we need you to put this money into social services. And so with that, Texas could apply to WIC. They could apply to Medicaid, food stamps, all those different programs. Okay? It is not only serving one area. So they use these in things like education, highway, building new highway, maintenance of highways, building new bridges, maintenance of bridges, all those things, mental health facilities, public assistance, and other areas. So, movement challenges federal authority over states through. So we have state lawsuits against the U.S. government, and we have a refusal of federal funds for social programs such as unemployment benefits, Medicaid expansion, public school funding. So one of the things that the state is very leery about whenever they accept money from the federal government is once they accept that money, the federal government usually has a little bit more say in how that money is spent or what they should do or what rules they should implement, regulations, all those different things. And so Texas is one of those states that they like to keep their autonomy. They like to keep their independence. And so the theory is if you take this money, we're going to lose the independence. So Texas tends to turn down these federal funds, even though for some of these things they are quite needed, but they tend to turn down these federal funds because of that fear. So we have state legislation that reaffirms state sovereignty, so the fight for the 10th Amendment. So this is state sovereignty under the 10th Amendment against federal powers not expressly granted in the Constitution, basically saying, hey, Constitution does not grant this to you, at least not outright. Therefore, we are going to fight tooth and nail because we don't agree with what you're doing. Okay? And Texas is very famous for doing that. So we have an expansive view of state sovereignty under the 10th Amendment. So bills proposed in Congress that affirm sovereignty and call for a new relationship between the federal and state government. We see a lot of these, and they usually gain momentum in the Senate, but not the House of Representatives. So, Texas Attorney General Kim Paxton and seven other attorney generals, filed a lawsuit Friday asking a federal judge to halt the Biden administration immigration program that allows some Central American children to legally migrate to the United States and reunite with their parents or legal guardians, including those who have pending asylum claims. So basically what you see going on here is there is yet another, and especially through our Attorney General, Ken Paxton is very infamous for this, another challenge from the federal level and the state level on who has the power to make these decisions. So the lawsuit filed in the U.S. District of Court in Amarillo claims the Central American Minors Program defies common sense and is rewarding those who break the law. So the program was created in 2014 under the Obama administration to allow children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to reunite with their parents in the U.S. rather than using smugglers to enter the country illegally. In 2017, the Trump administration ended the program, and in March 2021, the Biden administration restarted it. So not only do we have a constant fight, a constant going back and forth between the federal government and the state government, but things you'll often see, especially whenever the party of the president changes, is what the party who had previously had power, so let's say going from Obama to Trump to Biden. So the things that Obama did during his presidency, Trump, who was the Republican Party, right, undid a lot of what Obama had done under the Democratic Party. And then when Biden came to office, he then, as a Democrat, undid a lot of what Trump did under the Republican Party. So we often see not only that power struggle between the states and the federal government, but also between the two main powers and the two main parties themselves. So, and if you want more information on this, I've included a web link if you'd like to check into it more. So, historical development. So we have 6 constitutions that reflect the political situation of the time. We have the Constitution of the Coahuila y Texas in 1827. So this was created when Texas and Coahuila combined into a single Mexican state. Remember, Texas used to be pretty large whenever we joined the United States. We got a lot of our area cut out and made into different states. Tejas, this is what Texans called themselves under Mexico, so then it would be Coahuila y Tejas. So those who wished for independence opposed to this constitution. They wanted to, even at this early point in time, they wanted to declare independence from Mexico because they wanted to be able to have unrestricted trade with the U.S. In other words, Mexico could not interfere with their trade, and they wanted to continue slavery because Mexico had abolished slavery. They also wanted more representation in the Mexican Congress and more access to the Mexican government in English instead of Spanish. So we have the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, 1836. So this is after we had declared independence from Mexico. So this was created by Lorenzo de Zavala, who represented Harrisburg, so that's present-day Houston, and Francisco Luis and Jose Antonio Navarro, both representing Bexar, which is San Antonio. Okay. Then we have the Texas Constitution of 1845. So this is Texas's constitution as an independent republic, basically when we were a nation. Remember, in between being a part of Mexico and being a part of the United States, Texas had been an independent nation. So this is why you see with when you're driving down the road, when you see the United States flag and the Texas flag, you notice that they're flown at equal heights Texas is one of the only states that can do that because we were a nation before we joined the United States. Fun fact. So this constitution was used as our constitution for 10 years while we tried to convince the United States to allow us into the Union. So there were issues with the U.S. allowing us to join the Union. One of them was issues with Texas being a slave state. So this would offset the balance in the Senate. There were fears over Mexican retaliation if Texas was annexed. In other words, the United States was fearful that if they annexed Texas, Mexico was going to get angry and declare war. And this did end up being the match that lit the fire of the Mexican-American War, so they weren't wrong. So the treaty set the boundary at the Rio Grande River. It used to be at the Nueces River, which is a little bit north of that. And it forced Mexico to give up over half of its territory to the U.S. This is the territory that was used to create states like New Mexico, California, Colorado, and all those states all over to the west. So, the Secession Constitution of 1861, so this is whenever we had broken from the Union under the Confederate States. So this formed when Texas decided to join the Southern states in secession. They felt that the United States had broken its contract to serve the needs of the state fairly. So remember that there's a big theme that the United States government must serve your needs. This is called a social contract. And if they're not serving your needs, then you have the right to rebel. So this is what fueled that secession, okay, of the southern states from the northern states. It was the same reason the colonists broke from Great Britain. So this included changes necessary to break from the United States and provisions for the preservation of slavery. So we have the Reconstruction Constitution of 1866. So this provided direction for Texas on how to be readmitted into the Union. It recognized the rights of former slaves to be able to sue in the state's courts, to enter into contracts, to obtain and transfer property, and testify in court trials involving African American citizens, but not trials involving white citizens. It did not allow African American males to vote, hold public office, or serve as jurors. So Congress, they rebuked the Texas Constitution, meaning that they refused to recognize it, and they refused to admit Texas's 2 senators and 3 representatives into Congress. Okay? So, one of the things that happened here is that almost all of the states that had seceded from the Union, they had been put under military control by the North because they were seen as a danger. And so, under this military government, former male slaves were enfranchised. This means voting, so they're able to vote. They disenfranchised, meaning taking away that right to vote, anyone who had formally participated and or supported the Confederacy in any way. Okay, so they could find any ties in your banking records or anything that could tie you to that Confederacy and supporting them in any way. You were not allowed to vote. Okay, so the Texas Constitution of 1869, this centralized power in the state government. This is what finally provided that compulsory school attendance, so the right to go to school for every single child, boy or girl. Guaranteed full range of rights to former slaves. We had a corrupt administration under Governor Davis. He's a very infamous governor. He was put into office as governor by an election supervised by federal soldiers. This would have been by the Union. He imposed a martial law a lot of the time, meaning absolute military law. He was known for intimidating reporters. So if they said anything against him, he was known for pressuring them to change their stories. He was known for enforcement of voter registration. Positive thing, right? By the federal military, making sure that African American males were indeed given the right to vote. And officials that were supporters of Davis were put into government office. So he is known as a corrupt governor for doing this, but something, a side note that should be said here, is that this practice still, officials that support the governor or the governor candidate, this still happens today. It's very common practice. So, drafting the Constitution of 1876, we had 75 Democrats, 15 Republicans, 6 were African American. So African Americans did support the Republican Party at this time because they were the Republican Party were the ones who were under Abraham Lincoln. So the Democratic Party, I will be explaining throughout the semester a lot. The Democratic Party has changed completely from what we know from what it used to be. Okay, so back in this time period, 1800s, the Democratic Party was the party of the common man. The common man at this time being the white male, white land owning male to be more precise. Okay, so because of that, a lot of the policies that they supported had to do with those interests that were under the white landowning male. So the Democratic Party were very much against civil rights, very much against women's rights, very much for those Jim Crow laws and all those things. So it's at first it's a little harder to wrap your head around, only because it's completely different from the Democratic Party that we know today. So more than 40% of the members of this were part of the Texas Grange movement. This was committed to a strict economy in the government, so reduced spending and limited governmental power. So they dismantled the Davis administration. They restricted the powers of the 3 branches of government, especially the governor and executive, because it makes sense whenever you think about Davis was the governor, right? He was the one who was corrupt, so it makes sense why they would target the governor and executive branch. So they reduced the governor's salary, although it is still very high, the powers of the governor, and the term. So it went from 4 years to 2 years. It's back up to 4 years as of 1972. And it made all executive offices, except for the Secretary of State, elective for 2-year terms. Then we had the Congress and the legislative. So this curbed Congress's ability to tax and to spend. One thing you'll really see throughout these discussions is that Texas does not like taxes. Okay, they are very much against taxes. Okay, which you can really see whenever we voted to ultimately take out that ability to even have an income tax. Okay, so legislatures would then have 2-year terms, lower salaries, and limited legislative powers. So they really took this to an extreme. Why do I say that? In today's standards, our Congress is still only making $7,500 while they are in session. That is very, 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 very low. I don't know anyone who can be able to survive off $7,500 a year. Okay? So it's very low. And it'll have a huge impact whenever we talk about interest groups and lobbying. So judges and the judicial branch, judges were elected instead of appointed. Large cities voted against this constitution: Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Galveston. But the rural population, that means those living out in the country, helped it pass. So we have the distrust of the government and its legacies, as Texas lawmakers were limited powers spelled out in the state constitution. It provided for a weak governor and one of the weakest gubernatorial offices in the nation. This word, gubernatorial, all it means is governor. Okay, so whenever you see this word throughout this semester, all it's talking about is the governor. So the Texas Constitution of 1876. So this is the one that's still in place for 140 years. It's undergone many amendments. We have not changed the Constitution, just revised it basically through an amendment process. It has 507 amendments compared to the U.S. Constitution with only 27. Okay, so this is the advantage of a one-party state. Texas has been a one-party state for a very long time. We are at the point now where we are starting to see Texas starting to change over to being a two-party state. It's becoming a swing state. But for the longest time, it was a one-party state. So to give you an idea how powerful that is, remember the Democratic Party was the one who held power in Texas for a long time. They won over 100 years worth of governor's elections, back to back to back to back to back. Okay, so that's how much of a one-party state Texas was. So, the United States Constitution is very vague and can leave room for interpretation, but the Texas Constitution is very detailed and does not leave a lot of room for interpretation. In other words, there's not a lot of a gray area. So thus, whenever we want to make a change, unlike within the United States Constitution, when you can use that implied power, say, well, it implies that I can do this, so I'll go ahead and say I can. The Texas Constitution is so detailed that you cannot do that, so you have to have an amendment, okay? So, circumstances that can lead to the need for an amendment: change in the way the state pays its bills, so it's accounting for a need and a population growth, different partisan goals, etc., or abolish unneeded political offices. So, reduction in funding for the Department of Agriculture because it's not nearly as large as it used to be 100 years ago, or 150 years ago at that. So, Texas Constitution of 1876, other circumstances that lead to the need for an amendment or a constitutional change. Urbanization, that means the growth of cities. Industrialization, that means the growth of factories. Technological innovations, that means the growth of technology, so how our computers have changed, our cell phones have changed, all those different things. Population growth, so how our population has grown, right? Demand for programs and services. Countless social changes, especially the incorporation of civil rights into our Constitution. And an amendment process that is resolved by statutes. So a statute is a law proposed by Congress, and it must be approved by the people in a special election. So whenever they want to pass an amendment, Congress creates a statute, which is a law, and then it goes to a special election where people must vote yay or nay for the amendment. Okay? So, constitutional amendment elections, we've had 507 approved and 180 defeated. A lot of them relate to public finance, so property tax exemptions for many types of homeowners, surviving spouses of military members who were killed in action, or deceased disabled veterans, a dedication of percentage of sales tax revenue for the highway fund to maintain and build roads, and some have also focused on legislative processes. So, a voting record for all Congress members that is posted on the internet for public review. So, we're going to quickly go through this because we will go through this in more detail whenever we talk about the legislative branch. But the constitutional amendment process. This is a joint resolution, so it's basically proposed in the House and the Senate at the same time during a regular session or during a special session that's called by the governor. It requires a 2/3 vote in each chamber, meaning 2/3 of each chamber has to approve it. The Secretary of State then prepares an explanation of the amendment, basically explaining it to the people, and the Attorney General reviews and approves it. It is posted at each county courthouse at least 30 days before the election. Voters must approve the amendment in a majority vote, meaning 50.1% or more, in either a regular or special election. It's usually in a constitutional amendment election in November of an odd year. If the voters approve, the governor cannot veto and must instead proclaim it. So, we do have a lot of constitutional amendment elections. So because of that, we see something known as voter apathy, where a lot less people come out to vote because we have primary elections, we have state elections, national elections, local elections, all those different things. People kind of stop following what's going on because it's too much. Texas voters don't have a power of initiative, so this is the ability for a citizen to propose a law or amendment, and it has to have a specific number of signatures before it can be proposed. It bypasses Congress and goes straight to a vote. So some cities, home rule cities, have this and the ability to do this at the city level. State level, we do not have this ability. Some states do. We are not one of them. Okay, so constitutional revision. The first revision came out soon after the adoption, so this was more success in 1969 when a revision took out 56 obsolete provisions, meaning things that we don't need anymore. We had a comprehensive movement in 1971. So basically, we had the appointment of a study commission, and they named members of the legislature as delegates to a constitutional convention. They could change anything except for our Bill of Rights. The resolution was approved by more than half of Texas voters. In 1974, the Constitutional Revision Convention, we had 118 that were for it, 62 were against it. So we needed 121 for approval, but we were 3 votes short. So we also had the Montfort Plan 1995. So this drafted a streamlined constitution. So as we talked about, constitution is very detailed. Okay, so because of that, it's kind of hard for the regular Joe or Jane to be able to read this constitution and understand it. So under the Montfort Plan, they tried to basically streamline it and make it interpretable for almost everybody to be able to read it and understand what it says. It called for a voter referendum every 30 years, so that didn't require legislative approval. In a voter referendum, remember that is a direct vote by the voters on a particular proposal or issue. So basically, a voter can petition to have a law or amendment passed. If it reaches a certain number, then it completely bypasses the Congress and goes straight to the voters. Okay? Remember, Texas does not have this ability. They wanted to put it in under this Montfort Plan, but it did not pass. Montfort was hired as a chancellor of Texas Tech in 1996, and because of that, because he was the head person trying to get this thing passed through, it basically lost all momentum, and then issues of tax changes and welfare reform and educational finance took precedence over it. So it basically was put to the side in 1995 and still hasn't been touched since. So we have the Ratliff Juvenile Draft 1999. So this was assistance from Angelo State University students. This prepared a rewrite of that much amended 1876 Constitution. It introduced a draft for the consideration to the legislature in 1999. It was never taken seriously by the committee or taken to the floor for a vote. It would have cut the 80,000 word document to just 19,000 words, and it would have expanded the power of the governor, repealed the partisan method of electing judges. We'll talk about why this is an issue when we get to the judicial chapter, and increasing salaries of the House Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor. So Roy Wathall and the Bipartisan Team 2010. So this was an attempt to make the Texas Constitution more readable and usable. Claimed it did not change the document or its meanings. Unlike the one before, this one did not change anything about it, just the ability to understand it. It rearranged provisions to make it more logical and more readable sections. The governor would have to appoint a commission to study the reorganized Constitution. It could still take several legislative sessions, and just like the one before it, it has been put to the side and not been reviewed ever since. So things that have taken precedence, why have we not talked about these revised constitutions? Texas has had a budget crisis, a redistricting issue crisis, and a school funding crisis. So these things, not to mention the infrastructure crisis, right? These things have all taken precedence over the new Constitution. So the Bill of Rights, this guarantees protections for the people and property. It's similar to the one in the United States. One thing that we have in our Bill of Rights is that we have an Equal Rights Amendment. So you might remember, might have learned about how we had something known as the Equal Rights Amendment, 1970s, that, no, sorry, 1920s, that basically all it did was say that jobs, employment, all those sorts of things could not discriminate on the basis of sex. So whether you're a man or a woman, that's all it said. But it did not pass enough states and still has not passed enough states to this day to be able to pass nationally. So Texas has one of its own equal rights amendments that actually takes it further. You might notice that when you go apply for a job, it says that this employer cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, all those different things. That's an expansion on the Equal Rights Amendment that was actually passed by the Texas government. So we do have our own one at the national level. So because of this, it expands on women's rights and employment opportunities. It has the governmental rights against arbitrary, which just means random, governmental actions. We have a freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. So it's a double safeguard. We have it not only at the national level, but also the state level. We have cases of religion that have been taken to the Supreme Court. One is a student-led prayer before football games. This said it violated the separation of church and state since the school was a public school, so they were no longer allowed to do this. However, the Ten Commandments statue in front of the state capitol was able to stay because it was a historical monument. So the Bill of Rights continued. So we have the rights of criminals and the victims. So we have a right to release on bail. We have right to protection from unreasonable search and seizure. So basically that use of that search warrant, and right to trial by jury. And then we have that Equal Rights Amendment that we talked about. Okay, so additional protections. We have prohibitions against imprisonment for debt. In other words, a company cannot put you in jail for owing them money. We do have a convicted person protection, basically outside the protection of the law. So basically, outlawry is whenever we put somebody who has been convicted outside the protection of the law. So this is why whenever you see things like prison shows or jail shows, and they show when two inmates are getting into a fight, they could possibly endanger their or other inmates' lives. This is why you see the guards step in. Because under these Bill of Rights protections, this convicted person, even though they're serving a jail sentence, they are still under the protection of that law. So transportation, this basically keeps us from punishing a convicted citizen by banishment from the state. Basically, we can't tell anyone you can't come back to Texas, you must go live somewhere else. Free public schools, so it requires the state legislature to provide support and maintenance for an efficient system of free public schools, but there's still a lot of controversy surrounding the equality of schools and property taxes. So, the three branches of government. So we have a principle of limited government and a balance of power. We have that familiar doctrine of separation of powers. You'll notice as we talk more about Texas government, structure-wise, the Texas government almost, with some differences here and there, the Texas government almost mirrors the federal government in structure, okay? So we have that limited government, we have that balance of power, the separation of powers. Article 2 assigns lawmaking, law enforcement, law adjudicating powers of the government to three separate branches, known as the legislative, executive, and judicial departments. Sound familiar? So the bicameral legislature, when you see this word bicameral, bi means two, and cameral means chamber. Okay? So when you see this word bicameral, it means two chambers. Okay? House of Representatives, we have 150 members. We have a Senate with 31 members because we have 31 districts. And in 1936, we had an amendment that added a section granting the Texas legislature the authority to levy taxes to fund a retirement system for public school, college, and university teachers. So this tax is not passed on to the Texas people. The way that it works is that if you are in the education field, mainly a full-time education employee, you will notice that on your paycheck, you'll have part of it taken out for TRS. Okay, so that tax is only charged to Texas teachers, whether they be at the public school, the college, or at the university level. Okay, so the governor shares power with 4 other officers. So the governor is still the figurehead of these states, but we have 4 other popularly elected officials that are independent from the governor. So this is lieutenant governor. So the main duty of our lieutenant governor is to act as governor if our governor is temporarily absent from office, or if our governor dies, resigns, or is removed in trial, an impeachment trial, by the legislative branch. We also have the Attorney General, so this gives advice to the government on legal matters and performs other legal duties referred to or assigned to him by the governor. This is also who sues the United States in times when the state is not in agreement with what the federal government is doing. We have the Comptroller of Public Accounts. So this is basically the state's chief tax collector, the accountant, the revenue estimator, and treasurer. This is the person that will talk about budgeting in the legislative branch. This is basically the person who gives the legislative branch and the executive branch an outline of the money coming into the state for that time period. The Commissioner of the General Land Office that manages the public domain. So this was to collect and keep records, provide maps and surveys, issue titles. So, for example, they managed land used for renewable energy, so things like wind, solar, and proceeds from public land sold to help with the public school fund. So, the state of Texas has a bifurcated court system. So what that means, you see that word bifurcated? Yeah, we have that word bi, that's 2. Furcated actually means fork. So there's 2 prongs on the fork, okay? So we have a 2-court system. So one is for civil cases, this is the Supreme Court of Texas, and one is for criminal cases, which is the Court of Criminal Appeals. So we have 2 Supreme Appellate Courts that are courts authorized by the Texas Constitution, and intermediate appellate courts. Okay, and we'll get more into this structure whenever we get to the chapter on the Supreme Court. So, the right to vote, suffrage, and enfranchisement. So, we do have a photo ID requirement. The Texas legislature ultimately revised the photo ID to allow voters without one of the acceptable forms of ID to sign an affidavit that confirms their identity and provides acceptable documents verifying their identity, such as a utility bill. Bilingual bills are also required. So, in parts of the state where there is a significant portion of the city or of the county that speaks languages other than English, then they must also provide the ballots in that other language. So most of our ballots are in English and in Spanish, and then in Houston, they're actually in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So we have the pre-clearance eliminated in 2013. So basically all this was that any time, because of that danger of gerrymandering, southern states had to submit their redistricting maps to the Supreme Court for an approval. However, as of 2013, they have stated that this is no longer necessary. The gerrymandering based on population is not an issue, based on ethnicity is not an issue anymore, and so states no longer have to do this, although they are finding that some states, like Texas, are still kind of suspicious whenever they have done their maps. So I'm going to quickly go through the next chapter because I do realize we are running low on time. So bear with me. I'm going to talk a little bit faster. So if I'm going too fast, please let me know. So we have the Dillon's Rule and the Cooley Doctrine. Okay, so Dillon's rule, this dictates that local governments have only those powers granted by the state government. Cooley doctrine is basically a matter of absolute right, meaning that our cities have basically their own domain. In Texas, we have almost 5,000 local governments, and for these, Texas uses the concept of Dillon's rule for cities, meaning that the state's power trumps over the city's power. Okay? So, the tension from cities, we have a lot of different things that happens, just like how our state government fights with the national government a lot. Our city governments fight with the state government a lot, okay? And a lot of these have to do with things like unfunded mandates. So let's say Texas tells these cities that they have to improve the quality of air, they have to meet state jail standards, they have to provide access for the disabled. They tell these cities they cannot ban plastic grocery bags, which a lot of cities were actually getting a lot of money from that. Then cities tend to get angry because the state does not usually give money for these projects. So the city is forced to figure out how they're going to fund these projects. So intergovernmental relations is important in managing those regional, national disasters, natural disasters. So requests that are not always met. So for example, requests by Texas for recovery efforts in West Texas after the fertilizer plant explosion, the federal government refused to give Texas funds to be able to rebuild West Texas after the fertilizer plant explosion, and the state, not having these funds, could not help West Texas. So West Texas was a little bit frustrated with the state level government because they expected to have help because it was a disaster declared in that section. So courts sometimes have to settle taxation disputes between local governments. So the Texas Supreme Court had to decide a dispute between the Nueces and San Patricio counties over which counties could tax piers in Corpus Christi Bay because they both shared access to that bay. So grassroots challenges. So remember that this root, grassroots, means local. Okay, so citizens' concerns range from fear of crime, decaying infrastructure. Remember that has to do with things like hospitals, roads, police stations, so on and so forth. Controversies over public schools and threats of terrorism. So we need communication between the government and the states. The government-citizen communication is a law passed by the 84th Legislature 2015, and it required school districts with 10,000 plus students, municipalities with a population of 50,000 plus, and counties with a population of 125,000 plus residents to video record their public meetings and post these events online. So that way they become public knowledge. So it pushes for the government officials to be more responsive to their constituents and provide transparency. Hence that communication going on between the government and the citizens. It must be put online for no longer than 7 days after the meeting, and it has to stay online for 2 whole years. Okay? So growing diversity, so many African American and Latino Texans are seeking access to public services and local power structures long dominated by the Anglo, the white population. Okay? So basically what this is saying is that we have a growing diversity in our population of the state, and we also have a growing use of civil rights, being able to make sure that people have access to these rights. And so because of this, we have seen a lot more of our African American community, especially up in Dallas and down in Houston, and our Latino community, especially down in the southern part of Texas, really start to take over positions and get elected to positions politically. So these have happened at the city council, county commissioners' courts, school boards, homeowners associations, HOAs, neighborhood associations, community or issue-oriented organizations, voter registration drives, election campaigns of candidates seeking local offices, and we have seen influence in city halls, county courthouses, and special district offices from these populations. And it can address the grassroots problems because they are able to get involved in these democratic processes and they're able to help their local community. So we see a lot of widespread voter apathy. So one of the reasons for this is that our local elections are nonpartisan, meaning that there is no party affiliation. People usually depend on the party of an individual to vote, right? We have Republicans who usually vote straight Republican. We have Democrats who usually vote straight Democrat. So if they can't tell what a person's party is, it makes it a lot less likely that that individual is going to vote in that election. So, because of this, fewer than 10% of the community's qualified voters vote in these local elections because they do not have a party affiliation associated with their name. So, voter interest increases when people understand they can solve those local problems, those grassroots problems in Texas through this political participation. So, standard city responsibilities, things like taxing residents, we see this through property taxes, arresting criminals, collecting garbage, providing public libraries, and repairing the streets. So, two legal classifications. We have general law cities and we have home rule cities. Okay, so a general law city is a city whose powers are limited by specific authority granted by Texas statutes. Okay, so basically these are those cities that have to say and have to do what the state government tells them to do. Okay? Home rule cities, they have the right to self-government. They have a greater flexibility, structure, and operation. They're even able to do recall, initiative, and referendum. And we've already talked about referendum in the previous chapter in these home rule cities. But they can't do them in these general law cities. So forms of municipal government. So we have a strong mayor council and we have a weak mayor council. So strong mayor council, you can think of it as a strong executive and a weak legislative. So the mayor at large by everyone within the city, not separated by districts. Then the mayor has power to veto council actions. We'll be talking about what at-large elections is in one of our later chapters. So this one we have a very strong mayor because they're able to veto these council actions. Okay. Weak mayor council. This is a weak executive, strong legislative. The mayor has limited administrative powers. And the city council can override a mayor's veto. Okay? So, in the council manager form of government, which is a form of government that a lot of cities, especially major cities, are starting to use, public policies, legislative, are developed by the city council. Executive and administrative functions are assigned to a professional city manager. So, in a council city manager government, the elected official, the elected city council, serves as the city's primary legislative body, and they appoint someone within their council as a chief executive officer called a city manager. So they oversee all the day-to-day municipal operations. They draft the budget and they implement and enforce the council's policy and legislative initiatives. So, council manager, most home rule cities use this form, and the city manager is appointed. So, forms of municipal government, the commission. So, each government department is a responsibility of a single commissioner. In the commissioner form of government, the city is run by a small group of elected commissioners acting in the legislative and executive capacities. So, in other words, they've taken the legislative idea and the executive idea and they've combined them together when it comes to this commission. So, rules make a difference. So, non-partisan elections, no party labels. This has a low voter turnout. It's more personal, less issue level oriented. So meaning that people usually vote in these elections based on whether they like an individual rather than what this individual is trying to do. They have to do more research for each candidate rather than depending on the party affiliation, hence why we have a lot more lower voter turnout. So, ways to organize municipal elections. So we have at-large elections. Told you we're going to cover it. So at-large is a description for members of a governing body who are elected or appointed to represent a whole membership or population. Okay? This means that instead of having, let's say, a major city that is divided into districts, the city stays together as a whole, and they vote in this at-large election. Okay? So, if Texas's Congress was decided with an at-large election, each voter would vote for all 150 members of the House of Representatives and 31 senators. This means that if Texas chose to use an at-large election as a whole, that would mean that each voter would then vote for all 150 members of the House of Representatives and all 31 senators. Okay, this is why we use a single member district system. So the single member district elections, basically you cast a ballot only for a candidate who resides within their district. This is usually the ones where people are very partisan oriented. In this election system, voters cast a number of votes in our cumulative voting. They cast a number of votes equal to the positions available. Okay, so for example, if we have 8 candidates that are vying for 4 positions on the city council, meaning they're running for 4 positions, a voter may cast 2 votes for candidate A or 2 votes for candidate B, because there's 4 positions, right? 2 plus 2, 4, and no votes for any other candidates. They could also cast all 4 votes for candidate A. So in other words, you can divide out your votes however you want to. And in the end, the candidates who receive the most votes are elected to the 4 positions. So increasing levels of urbanization, education, and economic development. So this has made the state a lot more diverse. Houston is a great example of this. They have a strong business community because that is where our oil is, and they have a strong labor union. African American community has almost a century's experience fighting for its views and interests. So we see this a lot within their political system. A growing and increasingly organized Latino community. An expanding African American community that's becoming more, Asian American community that is becoming more politically active. We have an activist LGBTQIA plus community, multi-ethnic coalitions that have been the norm in Houston's mayoral races for decades. Non-business interests, they have a significant access to City Hall, meaning that a lot of Houston's initiatives that they pass, not all of them have to do with business. A lot of it actually has to do with local issues. And in 2015, Houston elected its second African-American mayor, former state representative Sylvester Turner. So Dallas is still known for having serious black-white racial tensions. Dallas has had serious black-white racial tensions for a long time. Conflicts have not been resolved, and changes in election rules have increased the number of racial minorities on the city council. And in 1995, Dallas's Ron Kirk became the first African-American in modern times elected mayor of a Texas city. So South Texas has Latino leaders at all levels. They are a very strong political influence within their community. In both 2013 and 2017, Texas had the largest number of Latino elected officials in the nation, over 40% of the total in 2017. And most of these were at the local level, namely South Texas. So since the 1970s, South Texas' majority Latino population has elected Latino and some non-Latino leaders at all levels. So city government's major job is to provide services, police and fire protection, water and streets, sewer and sanitation, parks and recreation. So employee pensions are a growing financial concern for Texas cities. So in the 2015 Houston mayoral election, dire predictions regarding the city's economic future because of its pension obligations, meaning retirement obligations, were a major campaign issue. The city contributed more than $350 million to its 3 pension funds in 2015, which is almost twice the spending for libraries, trash pickup, and parks combined. Okay, so this is an example of an unfunded mandate, saying that you need to have retirement systems for your officials, but not having funds given to the city to be able to meet that requirement. So most cities don't have enough money for basic services, meaning that they must reject or shortchange new services. Sales and property taxes are also limited by the state law, which is 2 of the main ways our cities get money. There is inadequate funding that is not proportional to population growth, meaning that the rate that the population is growing, the amount of money we're getting from sales and property taxes is not meeting that need. So we have falling prices of oil hurts the municipal government revenue and the ability of states to assist local governments, because we have this natural process of boom and bust of the economy, and our oil industry is really benefits or hurts from this. Okay, so for example, such as right now, our oil companies are making a lot of money, right? Because they're charging a lot for gas. But in years such as like 2020, when almost nobody was using their car, the oil companies were very much hurting, right? Because people weren't buying nearly as much gas. And our cities depend on those revenues. So it really does have a huge impact on these cities' economy and how well they're doing. So taxes, we have property and sales tax. So property taxes vary widely city to city. They charge in proportion to how much their property costs, its value. So people usually balk at higher property tax charges, which means that people usually get very angry whenever cities increase their property taxes. That's one issue our cities work with. And then sales taxes. So cities are able to charge an optional 0.5 to 2% additional sales tax in addition to our state sales tax. They have to get voter approval for this to happen, but again, this is a huge obstacle. People in Texas do not like taxes, so it becomes very much of a source of contention for our voters. So how much to budget becomes very difficult to estimate due to the unpredictability of consumer behavior and economic cycles, meaning that the use of these sales taxes, right? People have to pretty much guess how much people are going to be buying within the next 2 years, because our budget is created for every 2 years. So because of this, it's very difficult for them to make an accurate representation almost all the time. So cities can levy tax fees for beer and liquor licenses, building permits, traffic fines. Texas municipalities are authorized to create and own water, electric, and gas utility systems to have a profit for the city. Charges are also levied for sewage treatment, garbage collection, hospital care, and use of city recreation facilities. And this user fees may allow a city to provide certain services with only a small subsidy from its general revenue fund, or no subsidy at all. So bonds, so money for capital improvements such as construction of city buildings or parks, and emergencies such as flood or hurricane damage often must be borrowed. So the money is obtained through the process of municipal bonds. This is basically whenever a government borrows money with the promise that it will pay it back from the citizens. This usually happens over a period of 1 to 30 years. So the Texas Constitution allows cities to issue bonds, but any bond issued to be repaid from taxes must be approved by the voters, which again is often very difficult. So in November of 2018, there were 98 bond elections in Texas, with voters only approving 88. So property taxes and tax exemptions. So cities, councils, and community college districts may also freeze property taxes for senior citizens and the disabled. We also have property tax caps that can be implemented by city council action or by voter approval. Dilemma is that cities can help their disadvantaged citizens, but doing so costs the city often an extreme amount of revenue. So as our baby boomers reach retirement age, exemptions and property tax caps will also reduce our revenue even further, because they are still a huge portion of our population. Ranked from lowest to highest, the Lone Star State has one of the highest property tax rates in the nation, so 47th out of 50 in 2015. So because there is increasing pressure against increasing property tax rates, municipal governments sometimes refrain from increased spending, cut services or programs, or find new revenue sources. So typically, city councils are forced to opt for one or more of the following actions. They either create new fees or raise fees on services like garbage collection. They impose or hire wage freezes for municipal employees. They cut services such as emergency rooms that are especially important for inner city populations, because inner city populations are often low income which cannot afford insurance and health care. So the ER is the only place they can go. And then we have the contract with private firms for service delivery and improved productivity, especially by investing in technology. So, our counties, there are 254 counties. County governments often take over areas that are not served by a municipal government. So, for example, Decatur, Texas, this is a very large city, but most of it is served by Wise County instead of Decatur's municipal services. Okay, those people who are out outside of the city often have things like well water and have to find their internet through things like satellite because they don't have those municipal amenities that a lot of the actual cities, municipal citizens have. So the structure is set by the Texas Constitution. The Commissioner's Court is a major policy-making body within this, and it is administrative and legislative, not just judicial. So we have county governments often take over areas not served by the municipal government, so that's the Decatur. We have the agent of the state, so each county issues state automobile licenses, enforces state laws, registers voters, conducts elections, collects certain state taxes, helps administer justice. So they conduct health and welfare programs, maintain records of vital statistics like births and deaths. They issue various licenses, collect fees, and provide a host of other public services. State supervision of county operations is very minimal. Rural counties generally try to keep the taxes low and provide minimal services. They're reluctant to take on new responsibilities like regulating septic systems and residential development. This is why a lot of the people out in the areas that aren't served by the cities have the septic tanks instead of the sewage system. So metropolitan areas, however, counties have been forced by citizen and state demands to take on varied urban tasks such as providing ballparks and recreation centers, hospitals, libraries, airports, and museums. So there is an election of 4 county commissioners, a county and district attorney, county sheriff, county clerk, district clerk, county tax assessor collector, county treasurer, constable, judicial officers, which are the justice of the peace, and a county judge. All elected county officials are chosen in partisan elections, means party-centered elections, and serve 4-year terms. So Commissioner's Court is a major policy-making body. It's administrative and legislative, not just judicial. So county judge, this is the most prominent job in the county government and is the most influential county leader. They preside over the Commissioner's Court. They have administrative responsibility for most county agencies, not headed by an elected official, and in some counties they actually preside over court cases. The county sheriff, law enforcement, and judges. So there's statutory county clerks, district clerk, justices of the peace, and constables. So the county sheriff, this is the most prominent job in the county government, most influential county leader. They preside over the Commissioner's Court. They have administrative responsibility for most county agencies not headed by another elected official, and in some cases they preside over the court cases. So the law enforcement and judges, the county judge exercises important judicial functions such as handling probate matters, which are matters pertaining to carrying out an estate or will, small civic cases, serious misdemeanors, and in counties with a large population, the county judges are so involved in their political, administrative, and legislative roles, they have little time for these actual judicial functions. We have statutory county clerks, so these are established with lawyers for judges and more formal procedures. We have a district clerk, which maintains records for the district courts. Justices of the peace, which handle minor civil and criminal cases, including small claims. And we have constables, which serve subpoenas and other court documents, maintaining order in JP courts as the court's bailiff. The constable is the civil side of law. Okay, so this is things like enforcing child support, divorce agreements, wills. The sheriffs are the ones who work in criminal law. So the county clerk, they keep records and handle various paperwork chores for both the county court and the Commissioner's Court. They file legal documents such as deeds, mortgages, and contracts. They maintain the county's vital statistics, as birth, death, and marriage records. They may also administer elections. So counties with larger populations often have an administrator of election instead. The county tax assessor collector, they collect county taxes and fees, license tag fees for motor vehicles, fees for handicap parking permits. They commonly handle voter registration. Okay, so we have a treasurer and auditor. The treasurer receives and pays out all the county funds authorized by the Commissioner's Court, and the auditor is appointed by the county's district court judges. The function involves checking the account books and records of officials who can handle county funds. So, taxation and property is usually the most important revenue source. Occupations may also be taxed, but we don't have any counties currently who do that. Each year, the Commissioner's Court sets the county tax rate. So if property tax increases and exceed an amount that would generate up to 8% more than the previous year's revenues, citizens may circulate a petition for an election to roll it back. Okay? Tax incentives and subsidies. So they may grant tax abatement, so that's reduction or suspension on taxable property. They have reimbursement, so that's return of taxes paid. Tax increment financing. So this is the use of future gains of property value to finance current development projects to attract or retain businesses. They have pressure to increase taxes and balance budgets that's faced by our Texas counties. And the largest expenditures are for hospitals and healthcare, public safety, housing, and roads. So we have something known as a merit system in our large populations. So this is hiring and promoting based on competence rather than who you know. So counties with larger populations may establish a merit employment system, and over half of those eligible have actually done so. So our county rule system. So our suggested reform is county home rules to give counties more ability to organize and operate in accordance with local needs and wishes rather than what the state wants them to do. Research suggests that although county home rule better meets needs of the community demands, it also tends to expand county spending. Okay, so Texas prohibits county home rule and is unlikely to adopt it because then again that would make us have to raise our taxes. So border counties. We have unprecedented growth near the Rio Grande. NAFTA, now USMCA, has renegotiated a trade deal between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Most of these communities, they live in colonias, and they are very, very poor housing settlements. They often do not have running water or sewage systems. Current estimates identify about 2,300 colonias in Texas. Many of our 500,000 Texans live in these substandard conditions. They're extremely poor. The government does little to help. They have petitioned to even be able to have street lights to keep their children safe after dark and help prevent crime and vandalism, but they've been trying to do this for decades, which means they have been denied these basic amenities for decades. So, undocumented immigrants. In recent years, the flow of undocumented immigrants combined with continuing violence by drug gangs on the Mexican side of the border has created a lot of great controversy within our state. Our national government has the responsibility for border security, but Texas has supplemented the federal effort. We spend about $2.4 billion between 2008 and 2019 for our border. By the end of 2018, Texas had over 1,000 DPS personnel and 1,100 National Guard troops on the border. So sheriffs and police departments have received funding, both federal and state money, to increase their own capacities. Although violence in Mexico occasionally spills over into the Rio Grande, the Texas side remains relatively safe. So the border fence / the wall still under construction. The national government's decision to build a physical wall along the major portions of the border has created issues. It divides communities because we'll learn about these communities. They interact a lot. It separates families. It causes environmental dislocation, especially for the animals that live over there. And experts tend to believe that other measures would be more effective in impeding the border crossing rather than having a wall. So since the 2016 presidential campaign, completion of the border wall has been a major issue, and Abbott has actually continued that effort to build a border wall. So public school districts, we have more than 1,000 ISDs headed by a superintendent. Many of them have been quitting. especially up in North Texas, for many reasons, including state testing concerns, student success rates, funding issues, COVID issues, critical race theory debate, among many other issues. So we have an increase in state and federal requirements. There's accountability testing of students, which has played a major role in this. Districts have been forced to spend more time and money on preparing students for standardized tests. Supporters say that the testing has improved student performance and made local schools more accountable, but critics charge that students are now better at taking tests. They learn less in other areas, actual content. So, increasing ethnic and economic diversity. So for 2 decades, traditional minorities have been a majority in Texas schools. For a decade, a majority of Texas students have come from economically disadvantaged families. Meeting their needs is important not only for the children, but for the economic health of our state, because these are the future generations that are going to be serving within our communities. So equity in school finance is definitely a problem. So equity, the idea of being fair, just, or equal, or impartial. The amount, how much this should be spent. So in 1987, a state district court, later affirmed by the Texas Supreme Court, held that the state system of school violated the Texas Constitution. So the basic problem was that poor districts that relied on property taxes had to tax at a high rate to provide minimum expenditures per pupil. But wealthier districts could spend much more with significantly lower tax rates, and the issue still continues today. So, property tax is our only local revenue source for our public schools. The proportion of education funding provided by the state has remained at 40% or below, so our communities are the ones who have to make up this difference. The property tax revenue tends to grow slowly and to fluctuate, often does not match growth within our communities. The 2011 legislature, for the first time in 60 years, reduced the actual amount appropriated for schools, so it's created even more of an issue. Results were more than 10,000 teacher and staff layoffs, larger classes, and cuts in programs like arts, athletics, and field trips. Most of this funding was restored by the 83rd legislature in 2013 and the 84th legislature in 2015. But the help came too late because school enrollment had increased so much that the available dollars per student was still less. So junior or community college districts, you guys, so these offer, 2-year academic programs beyond high school and various technical and vocation programs. So each district is governed by an elected board that has the power to set property tax rate within limits established by the state legislature, issue bonds, and adopt an annual budget. So there are 50, and many of them have multiple campuses, as we all know. So non-education special districts, so there's nearly 2,300 of these. So first, many local needs, such as mass transit, hospitals, flood protection, they cut across boundaries of many cities and counties. Okay. Another reason why we have many special districts is that restrictive state constitutional preventions or the unwillingness of local governments to make it difficult for existing governments to take on new tasks. Finally, in some cases, individuals create special districts to make money for themselves. So we have had examples where real estate entrepreneurs in the Houston area have often developed subdivisions and unincorporated areas through the use of municipal utility districts. The developer is reimbursed for the infrastructure, that's the roads, water, and sewage systems, and the construction costs with bond proceeds. Basically, they put in the money, but they get it right back through these bonds. And then the homeowner property taxes are used to repay the bond holders. So the developer is reimbursed for initial investment costs, and homeowners ultimately repay these amounts through often high property taxes. So in other words, the individuals, they created these districts for private gain so they could build these communities and basically get back all their money, and essentially they did not pay a dime for it. So metro government, we have a possible solution to address variance in urban and suburban government. So the consolidation of local governments into one umbrella government for the entire metropolitan area. So for example, San Antonio and Bexar County governments consolidated into one. We've also seen this a lot in the DFW area. So we have 24 councils of government created in the 1960s. They perform things like regional planning and implement state and federal programs. Okay, last slide. So, municipal annexation. So, this is a law enacted in 1963. These cities have extraterritorial jurisdiction known as ETJ. So, limited authority outside their city boundaries. So, for example, the DFW area, which tends to annex unoccupied land, meaning taking it over, and they plan out development for the area. So this is designed in order to improve order in planning. A home rule city could regulate some aspects of development and annex so they can make an area a part of the city. Continuous, unincorporated areas without a vote by those who live there. In other words, they do not have to get the approval of these people in order to make this land part of their city. So incorporated areas could not be annexed without the consent of their residents. It makes Texas central cities larger than other states, okay? Which means the entire city becomes larger than an entire state, okay? And the city can annex contiguous, unincorporated areas without a vote by citizens living in the area, okay? So, marathon teaching. That is it for Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Remember, I moved your due date for Unit 1 to Wednesday, and I've done that for the consecutive units after this. If you look at the academic calendar, you should be able to see the new due dates for the next units. I will be getting Unit 2, 3, and 4 up soon, so if you want to work ahead, you can. Have a great weekend, and make sure to email me with any questions, guys.